Hello and welcome to a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate. I'm François Picard. As the incoming U.S. administration ponders protectionism and isolationism, we're going to start by turning back the clock 100 years. In 1917, the world's currency was still the British pound, but that was about to change with the United States entering World War I. The Americans would tip the balance in a war that brought Europe to its knees and embark on the road to global superpower. Events on the Eastern Front were also shaping a new world order, with Russia concluding a separate peace with Germany and its allies before founding the Soviet Union. The USSR is now long gone, so is the Ottoman Empire, yet that year, 1917, weighs high on the minds with references to the past anytime you see handshakes like this one. On that score, it feels like a fickle time, by the way, for national interests. Big alliances seem to get undone and renewed according to what's in the news cycle. An economy is once again at a crossroads for us, and a changing world order then, perhaps a changing world order now. When Donald Trump talks of making America great again and Britain harks for Brexit, is it a cry for the nation state of old? How different is the nationalism of 1917 and the nationalism of 2017? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about a changing world order. With us, he was a spokesperson for Mikhail Gorbachev, Russian historian Andrei Grachev. It's the 25th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Your latest book, published in French under the title Russia's Past is Unpredictable.
That's right.
Thank you for being with us. Also with us, literature professor Curtis Young, preparing a book and an exhibit on the Harlem Hellfighters, African-American soldiers in World War I. We'll go into details on that. I love the working title you have for the documentary project, When the Blues People Say America to France.
And the blues people sang America
sang
to France.
Sang America to France. With books like 1,000 Years of Annoying the French, journalist Stephen Clark's always grappling with the then and now. His latest work is fiction, up to a point. It's called Merde in Europe. Nice to see you, Stephen. And from Boston, Stephen Wald, who teaches international affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us from across the Atlantic.
Nice to be with you.
1914, Stephen, ended the old world order. 1917 gave us an idea of what was to come, didn't it?
Certainly it did in two senses. First, 1917 really marks the United States' emergence as a major player in the world stage when it decides to intervene in the latter stages of World War I, the first time the United States had really sent substantial amounts of military power far from its shores with the purpose of trying to dictate events in Europe, and then, of course, is very actively involved in the Paris Peace Conference after the war. We also see, I think, in 1917, the emergence of what then transpires throughout much of the 20th century, namely the clash of several universalist ideologies. The Western ideology of liberalism, personified by the United States more than any other. In the Soviet case, Bolshevism or Marxism-Leninism as an alternative universalist ideology. And you would also perhaps add fascism in the interwar period and with Nazi Germany as yet a third model for how to organize society. And it's the struggle between those three models that plays itself out over the next 20 to 40 years.
The struggle that plays itself out, Stephen Clark, those universal ideologies, are they universal today?
Well, there was also another universal ideology going on, which was colonialism, because you shouldn't forget that during the First World War, Britain had its eye on Iraq and on Palestine. France and Britain wanted Germany's colonies in Africa, which they took straight after the First World War. So there were sort of other bigger world interests as well. Now the trouble is with world ideologies is that you really don't know which is which anymore. It doesn't seem to be political anymore.
It's à la carte?
Yeah, and it's purely economic. And it seems to be less about countries now than about massive companies. It's almost as if the companies were taking over the world and sort of colonizing everywhere. So even though we have more media today, and these days we don't know what's true and what's not true in the media at all anymore. Maybe the world is even less clear than it was 100 years ago, despite the fact that they had to wait sort of 5 days for any sort of world news. Now supposedly we get it immediately, but we just don't know what's true and what isn't.
Okay, so the absence of these universal ideologies makes the world of 2017 harder to read than the world of 1917, Andrei Grachev?
Yes. Well, going back to 1917, I would say that if we make the list of these different ideologies, we don't have to forget they were providing attempts of answers. And answers to maybe the First World Crisis. It was the world crisis in the form of the First World War. It was the crisis of the colonial system. It was the first crisis, world crisis of capitalism as a world economy. And different ideologies were trying to offer different, opposing, clashing answers to this crisis. Russian Revolution was one of, at that time, very convincing attempts to provide an answer to this crisis, at least for Russia, but also for the world over, with the project of the World Revolution. Well, now, certainly, as you are saying, it's less clear because, first, we are living the age of the end of ideologies and of the collapse and of the, I would say, disappointment with the ideological answer.
Disappointment, that is so important because in that period, there was this belief that the future, even though there was this horrible genocide called World War I unfolding, there was this belief that the future would be better than the present and the past.
That was sort of the idea. I mean, this idea that this was the war to end all wars, that this was making the world safe for democracy, and these kinds of ideas, they were ideas. But I'm not sure that those ideas fulfilled their promise. In fact, I think it's expressed through a very important ideology that prevails today, and that's neoliberalism, which is the force that seems to be binding these nations today. I think that's one of the things that they have that we all share in common is this neoliberal idea that focuses on markets and focuses on issues of trades and focuses on issues of deregulation and these kinds of things, which in a sense undermine, if you will, the traditional role that was played by governments. So now neoliberalism, rather than being just an economic idea, which is how it was Hayek's idea when it was brought over to the University of Chicago back in the 1940s, early 1950s. This has become now a form of governance. And I think that's kind of one of the things
an ideology and a form of governance, you're saying. Now, of course, we talk about the world being this belief in the future, but there was also disillusion, of course. A decorated soldier in World War I, the British poet Siegfried Sassoon, wrote about that disillusion. He wasn't just a poet. A letter of his was read out in Parliament at Westminster in July of 1917. It chastised the public's indifference to suffering. I believe it may help to destroy, he said of his letter, the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not enough imagination to realize. Stephen Clark, you talked about fake news, but more important is indifference to like what's unfolding in Aleppo or
well, it was back then in the war. Of course, it was fake news, and soldiers like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and E. Cummings, the writers who actually wrote their memoirs, they actually said that some of them, they didn't even want to come home on leave from the front because they were so sickened by the propaganda that was being put out about, the glorious conflict going on the other side of the channel. So I suppose it's true, there was a lot of fake news back then. And really, that's the trouble is there's no excuse for it now, supposedly, because the Western nations are supposedly at peace now with a supposedly free media, and you're not supposed to have propaganda. Whereas now no one knows who's bombing whom. We see all these civilian casualties, and everyone's denying that they did it. I mean, someone's doing it, and no one's kind of admitting it. And so it is a confused world. Except now we should really have no excuse whatsoever for living in that kind of propaganda world. There should be people out there telling the truth. without endangering people like WikiLeaks seem to do. But, there should be people out there able to reveal what's really going on if someone wants to listen.
Stephen Walt, your thoughts on propaganda then and propaganda now?
Well, I think it's unfortunate and maybe a little facile to believe that we can have a clearer, transparent world today than was present back then. Certainly, there was an enormous amount of wartime propaganda during World War I, but we've seen in recent years that it's possible for governments to continue to manipulate information, whether it's the way in which President Erdogan in Turkey has essentially attempted to muzzle or silence media criticism of his government. Certainly what the Bush administration was able to do in convincing Americans that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was also in cahoots with al-Qaeda. So I don't think we can safely assume that propaganda has disappeared just because we have a wide open media environment. Indeed, we've just elected a president, or at least a president-elect, who sort of sailed into office by offering a series of 140-character tweets, many of which bore little resemblance to factual reality. I did want to draw a parallel, though, between an earlier point. The disillusionment after World War I is, I think, similar to some of the disillusionment we see today. Because when the Cold War ended, many people believed, certainly people in the United States, that we were now poised for an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. We had reached the end of history, that markets and democracy would spread all over the world under the benevolent leadership of the United States. And if we look at the last 25 years, that promise was not fulfilled just about anywhere. And I think that's what's driving much of the disillusionment we see in Europe, in the United States, and a number of other places around the world.
Andrei Grachev?
Well, going back to propaganda, I would say that maybe a new feature with it is that to a certain extent, and maybe more than it was 100 years ago, propaganda is replacing politics.
Mm-hmm. Replacing it. And sometimes it's even replacing war, because you are having much more of propaganda wars, happily, probably, than maybe an eventual or a real war, especially a possible nuclear war. But now you are having this kind of virtual propaganda wars, which are, I would say, even more sterile than before, because they don't have ideological background behind them. You are having a confrontation of opposite ideologies with the white and black world, with one against the other, and each one was imagining that he is living on the bright sun of the moon. And now it's all confused. And with the collapse of one utopia, that was the communist dream, that took 70 years, time of the life of the Soviet Union, it took maybe only 25 years for the collapse of the other utopia that we are living now, the neoliberal utopia, because maybe the fatal blow to it was the collapse of communism, because after it was deprived of its mortal enemy, it had to produce its efficiency, and now it's producing confusion and suffering and contrast across the world. So you always need a foil, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Like in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, they have like three different big superpowers, but they're kind of in cahoots with one another.
You mean 1984?
1984,
exactly. This is which makes, from my point of view, our situation more desperate than before, because you don't have hope for another utopia. I'm in need of utopia if utopia is an equivalent of an ideal.
Do you need a utopia, Curtis Young?
Yeah, we tend to create these utopian ideas. Narrative plays a tremendous role in our understanding of where we are, who we are, this sort of thing. To Andrei's point, in fact, at the end of in 1989, 1990, at the end of the Soviet Union, one of the key moments was Samuel Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, where he says, here's our new enemy, because the old traditional enemies, that was finished. And I find it very interesting that out of the Clash of Civilizations, one of the things that happened was the Americans, we created a new think tank, the Project for a New American Century, that was manned by Rumsfeld, Cheney, Richard Pearl, Christoph was a part of it, Wolfowitz was a part of it, and these are the people who went into the new Bush administration in 2000, and we know the
Decided
rest
to
of the
invade
history.
Iraq. Yeah.
Exactly. So so this was an attempt, I think, to Andre's point, to manufacture another utopian idea that had as its bedrock neoliberalism, and I think that's the crisis that we're dealing with now.
Stephen Clark.
Yeah, but new utopias are being created all the time. Brexit was the vote was based on this utopian ideal that suddenly London was going to be making every law for the Brits, not Brussels anymore, and that suddenly Britain's economy would take off if it was liberated from Europe. And most people thought that suddenly there would be no more refugees, no more migrants. People wanted to believe the lies. The lies were being pointed out constantly on the internet and in certain parts of the media. But people wanted to believe these utopian lies so much that 52% of them voted for Brexit. And it felt the same with the Trump campaign as well. People were, the sort of lies and nonsense was being pointed out by everybody on the sort of liberal side of the media. And yet there were enough people who wanted to believe in the utopia of this new leader who's going to make America great again. People believed in that so strongly, they voted for it despite everything. So I think these utopias are still really, really powerful because of this manipulation and the sort of failure to believe the truths that are being told to us, because the untruths are stronger.
When we come back in the special year-end edition of the France 24 debate, we're going to be looking at how, amid all the chaos, sometimes there are moments that are empowering. Good can come out without you noticing it. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's a special year-end edition of the France 24 debate as we get set to ring in 2017. We're asking what lessons 1917 can teach us. We're talking with Russian historian, former spokesperson to Mikhail Gorbachev, Andrei Grachev. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Curtis Young, who's preparing a book and an exhibit. We'll talk about it in a moment on the Harlem Hellfighters. We're also with Stephen Clark, his latest book, Merde in Europe, and Stephen Waltz, who teaches at Harvard University's Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us again from Boston. 1917, the United States enters World War I, and there's this unit of soldiers that we don't hear too much about.
You don't.
And yet they played a key role in, you might say, in the civil rights movement.
These guys, this unit won 171 Legion d'Honneur. The entire unit, they were the first unit to earn the Croix de Guerre, and the entire unit won the Croix de Guerre.
Yeah.
At the end of the
The
war,
War Cross Medal, which is...
at the end of the war, the French command.
We're looking at some of these pictures there. You can
Yeah.
see of the...
These guys, they were, when he was very important. That's Henry Johnson that you just looked at, who just received posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor 2 years ago. When the war started, America didn't have an army large enough to send to France. And so Wilson immediately asked Congress for the right to the Selective Service Act. With the Selective Service Act, all men in America, 21 to 31, had to sign up. This for these black men who were just 54 years out of slavery was an opportunity for them to show their loyalty to America. They weren't, however, allowed to engage in combat. They were put into a special unit called the SOS, the Supply of Service, and they came to Europe as workers. These are the guys who unloaded the ships, who built the roads, who buried the dead, et cetera, et cetera. The French had been waiting for replacements, 14, 15, 16, now 17, 4 years, Verdun, huge losses. And Pershing said no replacements. And at a certain point, General Pétain asked Pershing for these black men. Reluctantly, Pershing loaned them, and they were integrated into the 4th French Army under General Henri Gouraud. And they did a marvelous job. They were honored by the French. And when the war was over, the Americans told these guys, don't wear your uniforms, because this idea of having black soldiers in America was anathema. In fact, 1919 is known in history as Red Summer because of the lynchings and the violence against these soldiers when they returned home, because America was...
They got a hero's welcome in New York City.
They created a hero's welcome in New York City. They weren't allowed to parade. They created their own parade, and they marched up Fifth Avenue. They marched from 34th Street up to Harlem, and it was the biggest parade after the war. But these guys created it, and there it is. They were known as the Harlem Hellfighters. My lapsus was because they were known as the Blutstrucker, the Schwarzen Blutstrucker, by the Germans, because of the efforts of Needham Roberts and Henry Johnson, who we just saw his photo, who fought off a German unit with such efficiency that the German says these guys are the black bloodsuckers, and the French call them the Hellfighters, and that's the name that stuck with them up until today.
And we in this country have them to thank for introducing jazz music.
They brought they had James Reese Europe was one of the most noted musicians in New York at the time, and he created a band. And when they came off of the ship in Brest, January 1st, 1918, they lined up on the docks and they played the Marseillaise in ragtime. Mm-hmm. France had never heard this before. And they went on a tour, ending up in Aix-sur-Bain. And they, in fact, exactly. And they finally had a concert at Champs-Élysées, and the president, Raymond Poincaré, was there. And at the end of the war, one of these men, Eugene Bullard, who was not part of the 369th, but had been in the French Foreign Legion and a pilot, opened up the first nightclub in Montmartre in 1920. And the thing about this important in the context of our show today is that these guys, in their relationship with French soldiers, black guys from Harlem, French guys from Provence, who were operating underneath the meta-narrative, were just coming together, and they created a cultural moment that exists until today.
It's a moment of globalization in a sense, done thanks to this horrible thing called World War I. But Stephen Clark, when we see that those who are in contact with others, like the City of London, which voted against Brexit, they're the ones least afraid of meeting other people and of the immigrants that you described.
Yeah,
earlier.
you would hope so, although at the moment in London there have been outbreaks of anti-Polish, anti-Czech, anti-EU graffiti and violence since Brexit. The xenophobes have come out of the closet, encouraged by certain newspapers. Meeting people from other cultures opens your mind to other cultures. That's for sure. It's just a shame that in the First World War, these people were brought from a hell of a long way away to fight in the mud in France from all over the British Empire as well. There were lots of African soldiers, Indian soldiers who were brought in to fight, and who didn't really get much acclaim for that after. Britain didn't sort of suddenly free its colonies out of gratitude.
That's interesting. Unsung heroes when it comes to the colonized coming to fight in World War I. Unsung heroes as well in 1917 meant women in factories back home and on picket lines in Britain and in the United States protesting for the right to vote. Like suffragist Alice Paul, who you see here in this photo. She went to jail for her convictions. Yet, Stephen Walt, we don't talk about that much today, do we?
No, we don't. And one of the things I think we see in many societies, certainly true in the United States, is that in moments of national emergency, when people feel the security of the country is really at risk, then we are much more open to the idea of bringing all members of the society in for the common effort. What you see throughout American history is, voting expands when there's a sense of national emergency, when the country is at war. And I think we saw that again throughout the 20th century. And then, of course, when the Cold War comes along, you see the same thing, the gradual expansion of civil rights in the United States, a process that is still underway. What I find really striking about the story that Curtis told, which is really a fascinating one, is how it echoes with some of what we're dealing with today in the United States and elsewhere. If you recall the discussion from our first segment about the lack of a sort of bright utopian futures now, what's interesting about the, let's call them quasi-ideologies that are now emerging, is how nostalgic they are. Instead of looking forward, they are looking backwards. When Donald Trump says he's going to make America great, he says make America great again, as if we're going to go back to some earlier period that was wonderful and idyllic. Similarly, the people who voted for Brexit, I think we're voting in part for a return to an idealized image of what England might have been 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years ago. These are not movements that are pointing us forward. They're, to some degree, movements that are pointing us backwards. And part of that, of course, is going to be then trying to suppress groups that have different cultural backgrounds, different heritages, that in some way are different from that idealized image that is being used to at least persuade some people to buy into particular political movements.
Of course, the same can be said of today's Russia. It was interesting to hear Vladimir Putin during his State of the Nation address, sort of a bit of an ambivalence, because 1917 is going to be the year of commemorations of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And this is what he talked about when he talked about the need to preserve national unity.
It is unacceptable to drag the division, anger, offense and stubbornness of the past into our present life, and to speculate on tragedies that affected every Russian family, personally and politically, independent of which side their ancestors fought on. We must remember that we are a united people, and that there is only one Russia.
What does he mean exactly?
Well, it's a great paradox of today's Russia, because exactly as you said, as Eric Hobsbawm...
Because I can't tell if he wants to hark back to this golden age that Stephen Walt was describing, how it was much better in the past, or if he's saying don't look back too much.
No, it's. I would say it's more complex because, well, after all, let's not forget, 1917 marks the Bolshevik Revolution. Revolution that was oriented to the future. And it not only of Russia's future, but world's future at that time. Now, 100 years later, we are witnessing Russia that is proposing to a world a kind of a conservative revolution, a revolution which is oriented to the past, with the appeal of Putin to go back either to the memory of the Soviet Union and its methodology of governing the society, or even to the previous stage of it, Russian Empire or something of this. So from this point of view, Russia represents a society that, from my point of view, even if Putin, in a way, reproduces Trump's formula. Trump is speaking about making America great again. Putin is speaking about Russia rising from its knees. So
yeah, it's implicit when he talks about his greater Russia concept.
At the same time, if each country seeks for itself its own way of making itself great, that announces clashes, that brings us, unfortunately, to this dark era that, after all, provoked this terrible clash of the First World War. And, by the way, let's not forget, Woodrow Wilson and Lenin, almost simultaneously at that time, are recalling and reminding the horrors of the First World War, believing in a possibility of ending all wars and proposing to the world a new world order that would be just and peaceful.
All right, so if everybody's harking back and everyone's a nationalist, that's a recipe for danger. Professor Walt, your book, The Origins of Alliances, you talk about something called a balance of threat. Can you explain what that is? And do you have a balance of threat if everyone is playing the nationalist?
Well, the basic idea is that states form alliances primarily in response to external threats. And the external threats they perceive are a function of the power of potential rivals, also how close they are, geographically proximate, and whether or not the rivals appear to be particularly dangerous or have particularly aggressive intentions. So the more powerful a rival, the closer it is, the more hostile its aim seems to be, the more likely other states are to then form alliances against it. I think if you look at the present world, actually, what's paradoxical in many respects is that the level of danger faced certainly by the United States, but also by many others, is far less than at other points in time. Certainly far less than it was in the run-up to World War I. The great tragedy there being that all of these competing powers were actually very worried about one another, and countries like Wilhelmine Germany were deeply concerned about the rising power of Russia. Today, I don't think we face any situation quite like that. The United States is still, I think, the world's wealthiest and most powerful country, and extraordinarily secure here in the Western Hemisphere, with no powerful enemies nearby. We are somewhat concerned with the rising power of China, but it is not yet a peer competitor. It poses no imminent threat to the United States. And even in Europe, where people are concerned, I think, about Russia and concerned about the situation in Ukraine and elsewhere, it's not the case that Russia, to me, is a revanchist power that threatens to dominate Europe, or that Europe cannot ultimately deal with primarily with its own resources. There are problems in many parts of the world, most notably the Middle East, but these are not the kind of problems that are going to provoke, powerful, cohesive alliances. And that's, of course, what we've been talking about, is that there is no longer the same sense of unity in the West that you saw during the Cold War, or I would argue unity in some other places in response to the United States.
So not being locked into alliances is a good thing, is what you're saying.
Well, it has paradoxical effects. On the one hand, it means greater political division. We have more difficulty reaching agreement, and you see the centrifugal forces within the European Union, I think, are partly a function of the fact that there is no longer a common danger to provide an additional impetus for European unity. But on the other hand, it also does give individual countries somewhat greater latitude to pursue their own interests.
Stephen Clark, the important point there by Stephen Walt, which is that we have a world that's safer, yet in the period of rolling news channels like France 24, it can seem more dangerous, because if you have the same image of a bomb exploding every 20 minutes.
Well, it's true. It's not. It's less about big battles now than terrorism, which, of course, in the age of modern media, is a much more efficient tool, because you can terrorize everybody within seconds. And also, it's true, maybe Europe has got complacent, which is why so many people seem to want to leave the EU. It seems to be sort of grinding to a halt almost in its ideals. People don't realize that the ideals that the EU wanted to set out, which were not only political or peace, but also, good water, good air, good working conditions, they've sort of more or less been achieved, clean food and all that. The EU has done a lot of its work. And now people are saying, well, what's the point of it? And maybe, if Lithuania does get, Lithuania's reintroduced national service. They're scared of being invaded. If the Baltic states get invaded, then maybe people in the EU will wake up and think, well, maybe there is a danger now. But it's true, in Europe anyway, people probably have got complacent and just think that, there's no real threat to us anymore.
Are we the victims of our success?
Yes. Yes, and the reason I say that is because what we've been discussing are a range of alliances that reflect an old world order. I can't help but think about a photograph that I once saw of King George and Tsar Nicholas together. They're twins. These are the same families.
They were cousins.
They were exactly.
The Kaiser was a cousin as well. It was all about
There you have it.
cousins,
So there were these close alliances. This whole idea of nationalism was a relatively new idea out of the late 19th century. But what's going on today is something else. There are these anti-systemic movements that are going on that are represented with Brexit, Trump, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the Five Star, on and the Front National here in France. These are movements that seem like political parties, but they're, for example, Trump. Trump is a movement. That's not a political party. He hijacked the Republican Party as a vehicle for his movement. These are movements that are made up of workers. A lot of these workers are unemployed workers, petty bourgeois shopkeepers, retired people, this sort of thing.
But middle class people voted for him too.
But these are people who this old world order has left behind. That's why I brought up this idea of neoliberalism, that people are reacting against this and saying, and watching all of these guys connected with Wall Street or Brussels, and leaving people behind. So one of the things I think that we need to look at is for me, this is more not 1917 to 2017. This is 1848 again in terms of the revolutions that were going on around at that same moment. So this is something I think we need to look at.
Yeah, going back to a question about alliances. Well, I'm afraid to say that looking back into history, we discover that in order to build an alliance, you need a common threat, a common enemy. You've had anti-Hitler coalition that was built largely by Hitler, that could bring together very different countries and very efficient coalition. And then you had NATO and maybe the, let's say, unification of Europe that was built largely against the supposed Soviet threat, which is no more there. So, well, bin Laden is no more to replace the former Soviet Union. Do we need an external enemy, a threat? I know from Gorbachev that during their first meeting in Geneva with Ronald Reagan, at the end of conversation, Reagan asked him, Mr. General Secretary, Gorbachev was not yet president at that time, in case our country is attacked by the extraterrestrials, shall you support us? And Gorbachev said, yes, without any doubt. So do we wait for the extraterrestrials to give us reason for uniting while we're having terrible challenges with I'm afraid to say that, witnessing the possible collapse of what we are calling the globalization, which is certainly not a globalisation heureuse. It's not a happy globalization, but at least it is perceived by many as a dangerous globalization. So why not to react to it?
Stephen Walt, again, it's about perception. Are we in a happy or an unhappy globalization when you hear Curtis Young talking about all those forgotten by it?
Well, you can point to all sorts of disturbing aspects to it, and at the same time, there are benefits to globalization. You know, 1 to 2 billion people around the world have been elevated out of abject poverty over the past 20 to 30 years, and that is at least partly because of the spreading of global markets. What I wanted to emphasize was that, you know, as history proceeds, it's partly a matter of large structural forces like the spread of markets and things like that, but it's also specific leadership decisions, specific choices that people made that were not necessarily inevitable. And if you looked at the last 25 years and you imagine a few leaders making a different decision, if the Bush administration had decided not to go into Iraq in 2003, if they had paid a little bit more attention to what was happening on Wall Street and we had avoided the 2008 financial crisis, if Prime Minister Cameron had not decided to put the Brexit matter up for a referendum, which is something he did not have to do, did it as a result of some internal dealings in the Conservative Party. And I could go on and on. There were specific political choices that leaders have made that have brought us to this position, it was not, it seems to me, inevitable that we would have had the same crisis in the contemporary world order that many of us now perceive, and that has allowed movements like the Trump phenomenon and like some of the other developments in Europe to take place now. So it's some blend of large structural forces, but also individual leadership choices, and I would argue an absence of serious statecraft, serious and disciplined leadership in many countries around the world.
Leadership, so important. In 1914, it's the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand that sets in motion all these alliances that were locked into one another. You hear Stephen Walt talk about Brexit. Is it a Sarajevo moment?
So I hope not. Well, this thing about Sarajevo is that in fact, the heir to the throne who was killed was actually a sort of fairly meaningless person. Because he'd already been disowned by his father, the Emperor of Austro-Hungary. His children had been cut off because he was considered a very bad heir, and there was actually a younger, much better heir waiting in the wings. So this Sarajevo moment, it was in fact a sort of false moment in history. I know this because I wrote a biography of King Edward VII of Britain, who only reigned for 10 years, but he spent almost the whole of his reign, because he was the uncle of the Kaiser, he was the uncle of the Tsar, he was the father of the future King of England. He was a friend for Emperor Joseph of Austria. He spent all of his reign going around smoking cigars and drinking champagne with these people, saying, sort of, calm down, we don't want a war. We don't want a war. And when he died in 1910...
So it could have come sooner.
It could have come much sooner, because the Kaiser was going around, was provoking France and trying to get an alliance with Britain and failing to do it, and trying to get an alliance with Russia and failing to do it as well. And King Edward VII was actually keeping the situation calm. And when he died, the French then said, Raymond Poincaré gave a beautiful speech about Edward VII saying, the great European peacemaker is dead, now there will probably be war. And so it was a moment when, it's true what you say about needing leadership. He's not at all recognized, Edward VII, but in fact, in a sort of low-key way, he was keeping the peace throughout Europe because they were all his friends and cousins.
To answer Stephen Walt's question, why is good leadership so hard to find?
Exactly, yeah. What you need is someone with a sort of vision to do this. Edward VII was doing it mainly because he loved going to casinos and spas and things all over Europe. He didn't want there to be a war. And he could have warned these people. He probably did say, if we have a war, you're going to lose your empire. In the whole of Europe, the only empire that came out of it was Britain, and the only monarchy that came out of it was Britain. The Kaiser went, the Tsar went, the Austro-Hungarians went. It didn't take someone with vision, leadership, to sort of keep the peace. These days, it doesn't seem to be around.
All right, that is certainly one lesson that 1917 or 1914 can teach us about today. Stephen Clark, I want to thank you. I want to thank Andrei Grachev. I want to thank Curtis Young. Stephen Walt for joining us from Boston. Thank you for joining us here for this special year-end edition of the France 24 debate.